fighters of the Balochistan Liberation Army hijacked a moving train in Pakistan's far west. While they released most of the women, children and other civilians, there are still over 100 hostages, many of whom happen to be security personnel, either from the army or the local police, who are still inside the train and who are still held captive by the BLA. This is by far the most daring terror hijack in Pakistan's history. But the question is, who are the BLA? What is this organization, the Balochistan Liberation Army? Pakistan has declared it a terror organization since 2006. So has the US, but not the United Nations. They are not a designated terror organization by the United Nations. Certainly, the government of India has not viewed them as a terror organization. What sort of signal are they sending out to the Pakistani state by carrying out such a daring terror hijack that they have done on this train that was traveling between Quetta and Peshawar? And the most important question, in a big attack that happened in August of last year, right after that, Shahbaz Sharif, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, announced a $70 million anti-BLA program. What has happened to that? And what may be the Pakistani state's response now after this daring hijack?
सर हम लोग को छोड़ दिया, फिर बोला आप लोग जाएं भाई, अपना रास्ता पकड़े, निकलते जाएं, आप लोग के साथ दुश्मनी नहीं है।
पुलिस स्टेशन क्रॉस किया हमने, उसके 15-20 मिनट बाद, आधे घंटे के बाद ये बस एक हादसा हुआ हमारे साथ। बस उसके बाद फिर हम लोग वहाँ से पैदल हम लोग पुलिस स्टेशन पे अपने बच्चों के साथ हम लोग ये नाले के बीच में से लोगों ने हमें छोड़ दिया।
So the Baloch Liberation Army, the BLA, is an insurgent group which seeks independence for Balochistan, which is a province that's located in Pakistan's southwest. It borders Afghanistan to the north and Iran to the west. It is the biggest of several ethnic insurgent groups that have battled the federal government of Pakistan for a number of decades now. Their contention is that the Pakistani federal state unfairly exploits Balochistan's rich gas and mineral resources. The insurgents have been fighting to lay a claim to local resources which they say belong to their people, and their people are not getting a fair share. Balochistan's mountainous border region serves as a safe haven as well as a training ground for these Balochi insurgents as well as Islamist militants. So how did they become particularly lethal in the last few years? The BLA shocked the entire country's security establishment when it barged into an army and navy base back in 2022. That was the first big daring attack that they made on a military facility. It's also deployed women suicide bombers, including an attack on Chinese nationals at a university in Karachi, as well as a bombing in southwest Balochistan which targeted a Chinese infrastructure project. An umbrella group of several Baloch ethnic groups said last week that it had convened all factions in a bid to unite them under a unified military structure. Remember, the Balochis are largely driven by their tribal loyalties. This is the first attempt to try and unify a Balochi identity over more parochial, more traditional tribal identities. So the Balochistan dispute in Pakistan has got a long and complex history. It dates all the way back to 1948, right after Pakistan got independence and became a new nation. In fact, in 1948, the region, which is Balochistan, was forcibly integrated into Pakistan. The Khanat of Kalat initially declared independence. He was the ruler of Balochistan. It was a princely kingdom. He declared independence, but then was pressurized by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of modern-day Pakistan, to accede to Pakistan, even though they were very good friends. This led to the first wave of armed resistance or insurgency in Balochistan. And subsequently, over a number of years, number of occasions, there have been repeated insurgencies from 1958 to 63, 69, 73 to 77. Each of them was marked by escalating violence, and more indigenous Balochi tribes were taking part in the insurgency. The current insurgency, which began in 2003, is fueled by grievances over resource exploitation as well as the marginalization of the Baloch people. Remember, they have a twofold grievance. One, that Punjabis and Sindhis, who are the majority ethnicities of Pakistan, they have come and taken over the resources and the natural habitats in Balochistan. But more importantly and more recently, there's also severe backlash against Chinese projects, China-funded projects like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a $60 billion infrastructure project, much of which passes through the rest of province of Balochistan. So the Baloch people off late have been unhappy with Chinese projects, particularly CPEC, and there are a number of reasons for this. They feel that the Baloch natural resources are being exploited without them getting an adequate share or benefiting the local population. There's also the influx of workers, basically Punjabi-speaking folks from Lahore, which is the biggest city, or even Sindhi-speaking folks from the south of Pakistan, as well as Chinese workers themselves. The fear of the Baloch is they're being rendered a minority in their own region. These projects are seen as consolidating federal control over Balochistan. Also, it doesn't help that Balochistan has had numerous premiers over the last 10 years or so, and that undermines local autonomy for the politicians in that province. So this is an ongoing hostage situation. Over 100 hostages have been released from that train, the Jafar Express, and over 100 are reportedly still being held captive by the BLA. Let's try and make sense of this, not just the immediate story that is happening, but also, more importantly, what is the BLA? Why are they behind some of these major terror attacks that have happened in Balochistan? And what now happens between this ongoing rivalry, this ongoing standoff that's happened over a period of time between the Pakistani state and these Baloch rebels? I want to go across to someone who knows a thing or two about Balochistan. Tilak Devasher is former Special Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat, also the author of this fascinating book, The Balochistan Conundrum. Thank you very much, Mr. Devasher, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. I want to talk about what's happening right now in Balochistan, the hijacking of this Jafar Express. There's conflicting reports coming. Obviously, it's an ongoing situation. It's a fluid situation. The Pakistan Army claims that they have eliminated about 30 of these Baloch rebels. The Baloch rebels, on the other hand, the BLA folks who've taken over this train, they are saying that they released about 80 women and children, and the others who've been released too have been released because they wanted them out, and that they are sticking to security personnel as the hostages on board the train. Just try and make sense of this story for us. What are you picking up? And have you seen anything like this before? Do you believe that the hijacking of this Jafar Express train is an inflection point in the ongoing war between the Pakistani state and the BLA?
Yes, first of all, as you rightly said, it's a developing situation. There's a lot of fog of misinformation that is going around. But I was seeing something on X that the people who have been released, the hostages, they say that they were released by the fighters, Baloch fighters. The Pakistan Army claims that they were rescued them, which has been totally debunked by the people who have actually been released. It's typically Pakistan Army to claim credit when it's not theirs. So that's one part of it. The second, yes, it is an inflection point. It is a very, very, I've never seen this kind of an escalation in the insurgency. People in the future will talk about pre-Jafar Express and post-Jafar Express incident, because in all the years that I've watched Pakistan, in fact, in other places also, a train has never been hijacked. Hijacking a train is a huge event, to coordinate that. How do you stop a train which is moving? So the planning which is involved, the coordination that is involved. So this is it takes the insurgency up to a totally new kind of level. In fact, the only other time when a train was to be hijacked was in Sholay. If you remember, the dacoits tried to hijack the train, and Viru and Jay stopped that. But so this is upscaled it now, and this has got international attention. Irrespective of what the outcome is, everybody is going to be asking that why did a train have to be hijacked? It's got the attention of the international community like never before.
So tell us a little bit more about this Balochistan Liberation Army, because all of the big attacks, the big terror attacks that have happened in the recent past in Balochistan have carried the imprint of the BLA. They've either directly claimed responsibility or the Pakistani state has held them responsible for it. What do we know about the Balochistan Liberation Army? What do we know about the Murray family, the Murray tribe, which controls the BLA? And, despite whatever it has said and done, all of these multiple military operations that the Pakistan Army has undertaken against the BLA, including, I think, Shahbaz Sharif announcing about $60 million or something of that sort, just specifically on these terror operations against the Balochistan Liberation Army. Why is it that the might of the Pakistan state has not been able to, eliminate the Balochistan Liberation Army?
Like all insurgent organizations, this is a very shadowy organization. We don't have full details about the leadership profile. Where is it located? Who are the leaders of it? It is suspected, as you rightly said, to belong to the Mari Kabila, the Mari tribal group. The leader at one time was Baloch Mari, the eldest son of Khair Bakhsh Mari. He was killed in Afghanistan. But thereafter, it's a very shadowy kind of a thing. We don't know, what the leadership thing is. But that is not so much an important thing. The important thing is that they have now expanded beyond the tribal limits of the Mari tribe. And that's why they are so successful, and that's why they've been able to launch operations not just in the Mari area, tribal area, but all over Balochistan. So that means obviously other people have also joined it. And I think, and recently, if you remember, all the Baloch groups seem to have got together and decided that they will fight unitedly and carry out united and coordinated operations and give the name to themselves of the Baloch National Army. This was announced and came out and made a lot of noise in the media. And if this happens, if the Baloch are able to get out of the mold of tribal loyalties and fight unitedly, it'll be a force multiplier for the against the Pakistan Army. The Pakistan Army is going to have a very tough time in trying to deal with a united Baloch organization that is, taking them on in different parts of Balochistan rather than only in the tribal belt.
Also, if you could give us a bit of a historical context. Obviously, the fight between these Baloch rebels and the Pakistani state has been going on since independence, since 1948, really. But particularly in the last few years, is there a feeling in the Baloch people, which has now been espoused by these rebels, that their land is being exploited, their resources are being exploited, and they are not getting a fair share of whatever is being taken by the Pakistani state from Balochistan, and also all of this anger that we're seeing against these Chinese projects, the CPEC projects inside Balochistan. Just give us a bit of a historical context to this ongoing sort of standoff, confrontation between the Baloch rebels, the Baloch people really, and the Pakistani state.
Actually, there are two reasons. First of all, this goes back to 1948. When the princely state of Kalat, as Balochistan was then called, the accession was done forcibly. The Khan of Kalat was kidnapped from his place and taken to Karachi and forced to sign the instrument of accession, even though Jinnah was a personal friend of his, and Jinnah was his lawyer, who pleaded the case for Kalat's independence to the British. It's a real irony of history. So, and the Khan of Kalat's brother broke out in insurgency in 1948 itself. So whenever the Baloch have been strong, or they felt they were strong, they've broken out in insurgency. There was insurgency in 48, there was insurgency in 1960, there was insurgency in 73, 77. And this particular insurgency has been carrying on since 2004. So this is the real underlying reason of why the Baloch have not reconciled to being a part of Pakistan. And you cannot ignore this particular issue. And the second thing is resources, yes. But it has gone beyond resources. And one of the tactics that the Pakistan Army has utilized in Balochistan is this missing persons. They just pick up people without any arrest warrant. They are tortured, and their mutilated bodies are sometimes found and sometimes not even found. So you have a large number of women, for example, who don't know whether they continue to be married or they are widows. There's a term in Balochistan, a very unfortunate term called half widows, where somebody whose husband has been missing for 15 years doesn't know whether his husband is alive or dead. And likewise with the fathers, likewise with brothers, likewise with sons. So this kind of, pushing the Baloch to the wall is one of the major reasons why, on the one hand, now the women have come out to the forefront and are leading civil society protests against missing persons, and the remaining younger people among the Baloch have joined the armed groups, because they know that if they continue to stay at home, they're going to be picked up one day or the other and killed. So they might as well join one of these armed groups, kill a few Pakistanis before they go. So these are the two fundamental reasons. And then you add to that the exploitation of resources, the Chinese factor, that's what you mentioned. So it's the real witch's brew.
All right, Mr. Tilak Devasher, thank you very much for joining us and putting this issue into perspective for our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Shifting focus now, Elon Musk and his Starlink has decided to make an entry into the Indian market, and it's been in the works for a while now. Both Airtel and Jio have entered into a partnership with SpaceX to provide Starlink services through its physical stores as well as its online platforms once all regulatory approvals are secured from the government. Now, while the finer details are yet to be chalked out, the venture will not just enhance connectivity across the country, but also comes as a boost to India's strategic ambitions. Now, through this partnership, Jio's position as the largest mobile operator in the country will be cemented in terms of data traffic, alongside Starlink's status as the leading low Earth orbit satellite constellation operator. It will deliver dependable broadband services across the country, particularly in far off and remote areas which are not that easily accessible. Jio will offer Starlink solutions through its retail outlets as well as through its online storefronts. The company plans to provide Starlink equipment in its physical stores and also establish a customer service installation and activation process. The services will also be offered in the most rural and the most remotest parts of India. The agreement allows Jio and SpaceX to explore ways that Starlink can enhance Jio's services and complement SpaceX's direct offerings to both consumers as well as businesses. So a basic question that you may ask is, how does Starlink differ from any regular internet service that you and I use currently, whether it's broadband, whether it's mobile data services? Starlink operates on a network of thousands of smaller, low Earth orbit satellites. So their trajectory is much lower up in space as compared to traditional satellites that ISRO launches. So the traditional internet, which is, internet broadband, it's based on ground-based and deals with fiber, with cable, with copper, etc. And then you have mobile internet, which is wireless, and so far it is ventured either to 4G cellular networks, or in some places there are even 5G cellular network towers. Now, with a near global reach, Starlink can also reach the most remote and most inaccessible rural areas of the country. While the reach of traditional internet is limited to urban, perhaps even suburban spaces, and mobile internet, of course, is dependent on whether you have network coverage, whether you have adequate towers in the area where your mobile phone is. In terms of speed, Starlink can provide anywhere between 50 to 220 megabits per second, which is, of course, again, location dependent. But in comparison, traditional internet provides up to 1 gigabit per second on fiber and 500 megabits per second on cable, while mobile internet can give you anywhere between 20 to 200 megabits per second with the 4G network, and for the 5G network it can be between 50 and 1000 megabits per second. The affordability factor, and this could be a critical one in a price-sensitive market like India, there can be a hiccup as far as price sensitivity is concerned, particularly for the middle class. Starlink's standard plan would cost somewhere between 10,000 rupees and 20,000 rupees. The traditional internet, your broadband at home, costs roughly about 1,000 rupees a month, and mobile internet can cost a little over 1,200 rupees on average per month. But Starlink would be almost 10 times that cost. Availability, though, could make up for it. Starlink is expanding globally. It can reach, like I said, the most isolated areas of the country. Traditional internet is limited by broadband infrastructure, which is restricted largely to urban or urbanized areas. And mobile internet, again, depends on your cellular tower connectivity, which generally is a little weaker in rural areas compared to urban ones.
Well, in the last few years, our social media feeds are full of Elon Musk's SpaceX rockets taking off and landing, making for fascinating visuals. But ever wondered what exactly were they shooting up in space? Well, the answer, a web of over 6,000 satellites to connect the entire world with internet. And in the last 24 hours, Musk has announced the first major step towards bringing that constellation here to India. Now, Musk's SpaceX-backed Starlink has inked agreements with the world's largest telecom network, Jio Platforms, and its largest competitor, Airtel. Last evening, Airtel announced the partnership with Starlink, and just hours later this morning, Jio made the big reveal. The two telecom behemoths who once looked at SpaceX as a competitor have now opted for a hybrid approach of terrestrial and satellite networks. Now, Starlink's agreement with Jio and Airtel seems to be configured towards penetrating the Indian market using the vast distribution network and on-ground presence of both the telecom bellwethers. Jio Platforms, in its release, had proposed offering Starlink solutions through its online and brick-and-mortar stores. Other than equipment, Jio also expressed willingness to provide installation, activation, and customer support solutions to Starlink. Similarly, Airtel has proposed to offer Starlink equipment in its stores. Airtel has also proposed exploring how Starlink can use Airtel's network. Additionally, Airtel is also keen on exploring how it can offer Starlink's bevy of enterprise solutions to business customers and communities. So how exactly does Starlink work? How is Starlink different? Well, broadly speaking, a terrestrial network works by connecting your mobile to the local telecom tower, lakhs and thousands that we've seen around our homes and offices. Now, Satcom works a little differently. It has no towers. Instead, Satcom players like Starlink deploy a web of low Earth orbit or LEO satellites. Users of Starlink can buy a dish for their home or business. This dish will use airwaves for transferring data and providing internet connectivity directly via the satellite.
All right, let's move on to the other story that we're tracking. US Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife Usha Vance are both all set to visit India later this month. Like I said, he will be accompanied by his wife and second lady. This will be Vance's second international trip after taking office as Trump's deputy, the number 2 in the White House. J.D. Vance's international engagements as vice president are part of a broader effort to try and establish his own diplomatic presence on the global stage. As a key figure in shaping U.S. foreign policy, J.D. Vance's visit to India will be closely watched by international stakeholders. His approach to diplomacy has been marked by a bit of forthrightness, a bit of curtness, if you will, but certainly strategic clarity. And that has divided experts, particularly in Europe. When he spoke at the Munich Security Conference, a lot of eyebrows were raised, a lot of feathers were ruffled, but it could offer deep insights into how the Trump administration is prioritizing foreign policy and which countries it is prioritizing moving forward, and whether or not India finds itself up the pecking order. The visit by J.D. Vance is important both diplomatically and, of course, personally. It highlights the deepening of ties between the United States and India. The number 2 man in the White House is married to an Indian American. That is more than just symbolism. Now, the trip to India marks his second international trip since he assumed office. It follows his earlier trips to France and Germany. He had gone essentially for the Munich Security Conference. He engaged in high-level discussions with European leaders. He was also part of the Global AI Summit, which France hosted a few weeks ago. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance will be accompanied by his wife, Usha Chilukuri Vance, who will be visiting her ancestral country, the country of her ancestors' origin, if you will, for the very first time in her new role as the Second Lady of the United States. And that adds a degree of personal significance to the trip. The Vice President's agenda in India has not been detailed out yet by the embassy here in Delhi, but it is anticipated the discussions will encompass a range of bilateral issues, including, of course, the Trump administration's stand on levying counter tariffs or reciprocal tariffs on India starting the 2nd of April. Back in February, during a meeting in Paris, J.D. Vance and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, they had met on the sidelines of the Global AI Summit and discussed the Indo-US partnership. Meetings between the duo during that visit would make it the second meeting within just a month or so. Within the current geopolitical context, India also represents a crucial strategic partner for the United States, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, as China seeks to assert its authority in its backyard and beyond. Strengthening ties with India aligns with America's strategic interests. This visit could serve as an opportunity to reinforce the India-US strategic partnership. While he was in Paris on the sidelines of the AI Summit, where he also met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, US Vice President J.D. Vance and Second Lady Usha Vance had a candid conversation with the Prime Minister. The PM also gave gifts to the Vance's children. In fact, one of them was celebrating their birthday on that very same day, and they even cut a cake all together. During the AI Summit, Vance echoed Prime Minister Modi's comments, lauding his vision, pointing to the warmth in ties at a personal level and also the strategic convergence between Washington and New Delhi. This is what J.D. Vance had said about India at the AI Summit.
I appreciate Prime Minister Modi's point. AI, I really believe, will facilitate and make people more productive. It is not going to replace human beings. It will never replace human beings. And I think too many of the leaders in the AI industry, when they talk about this fear of replacing workers, I think they really miss the point. AI, we believe, is going to make us more productive, more prosperous, and more free.
While talking about J.D. Vance's boss, Donald Trump, he's halted a plan currently to double U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and metal imports to 50%, just hours after he made that announcement in the first place. The tariffs at 25% are still going ahead. It will take effect from today. The move comes after the Canadian province of Ontario, which is the largest, suspended its orders to levy a 25% surcharge on electricity that goes from from Ontario to some of the northern states in the United States. In an exclusive conversation with Money Control, Blackstone CEO Stephen Schwarzman has said that tariff charges are a short-term phenomenon, and he says that the world, including India, will learn to adjust to the Trump tariffs.
Is there a number that you can give us to our viewers in terms of how this number can go up? Can 5% become 10% or 15%, and over what kind of period of time?
Well, it's great to be back in India. When we decided to come here, we announced that we would put $1 billion in India.
Right.
And people here probably forget that 20 years ago that was a huge number. And we were on the front pages of all the newspapers. And now, as you say, we're many times what we expected to be, because the country is such a great place to operate. India happens to be our #1 performing market in the world for Blackstone. Our returns here on a gross basis are somewhere around 40%.
You're talking about 100 billion of assets under management in India over, that is, if you were to double that number.
No, you gave us the right number, and we think we can grow to $100 billion.
There is the China +1 strategy which most MNCs are following. Blackstone has a presence across a wide range of industries. Now, India fancies itself as the +1, although there are competitors like Vietnam, most prominently, perhaps Indonesia as well. Do you see India's name coming up as a possible substitute for China when it comes to global supply chains?
Well, I think it's been a difficult time period for China.
Right.
They will go through some adjustments as well to their benefit. But at the moment, India became, sort of top of mind for the business community as an alternative.
Right.
And that's a great opportunity for India. I think it's important that India capitalize on that opportunity. It's got, sort of low-cost labor, smart people.
Meanwhile, it's been 3 years since the war in Ukraine began. Now the United States is hoping to bring Russia and Ukraine on the same page and put in place a ceasefire. Talks between America and Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia and Jeddah ended with Ukraine agreeing to an immediate 30-day ceasefire. The Kremlin, though, is yet to react in a way that would give hope. It is being extremely cautious at the moment. But the big question is, will Putin agree to the terms that were agreed upon without Russia being at the negotiating table? In fact, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said now the ball is in Putin's court. And Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, will be in the Kremlin as early as later this week. So, will Putin agree? And if he doesn't, what happens next? I delve a little deeper. Ukraine has expressed its willingness to support an American proposal for a temporary ceasefire with Russia. This marks a significant step after extensive discussions in Saudi Arabia. These talks culminated in an agreement by the United States to resume military aid and intelligence sharing with Kyiv both of which had been suspended following a tense meeting between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House back in February, which led to a full-blown diplomatic meltdown. The negotiations were held in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, under much calmer circumstances and a much calmer environment. It was a bid to reinvigorate the effort to establish a 30-day ceasefire, which had been stalled because of previous disagreements. The Trump administration had halted both military assistance and intelligence sharing after the confrontation at the White House on the 28th of February. But these latest developments out of Saudi Arabia, which were announced jointly by both countries, America and Ukraine, coincided with reports of Ukrainian drones targeting Moscow in what Moscow described as the largest attack on the Russian capital since this conflict began 3 years ago. The joint statement issued by Ukraine and the United States acknowledged that any ceasefire, and in this case it would be an initial 30-day period of cessation of hostilities, would ultimately have to require the approval of Russia. However, Moscow, which did not take part in these talks in Jeddah, refrained from commenting on the 30-day ceasefire proposal. Ukraine has indicated it is ready to implement a provisional 30-day ceasefire if Russia were to reciprocate the same. The United States, in turn, has pledged to convey that Russian cooperation is essential to achieving peace between Moscow and Kiev. Leading the U.S. delegation were Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, while the Ukrainian team included Andriy Yermak, who is a senior advisor to the Ukrainian president, as well as the foreign minister and the defense minister of Ukraine. Although Ukraine had initially said that there has to be explicit security guarantees for any ceasefire agreement to work, the joint statement that was issued in Saudi Arabia did not confirm any such security guarantee. In fact, that was the reason why the blow-up happened at the White House between Trump and Vance on the one side and Zelensky on the other. Michael Waltz, the U.S. National Security Advisor, did note that security guarantees were discussed between the officials of Ukraine and America, but it was not explicitly mentioned in the joint statement. Secretary of State Marco Rubio emphasized that the next phase involves persuading Russia to end the hostilities, even if it is for this 30-day period. This is what Mr. Rubio said after the talks.
Hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball is now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
He also underscored that the responsibility to make this ceasefire work now lies with Russia. Despite the ongoing US-Ukraine discussions, there is no indication from Russia that it would accept a month-long truce, and that too without any conditions whatsoever. Russian President Vladimir Putin has signaled that he would demand concessions from Ukraine, like, for example, Ukraine completely renouncing any aspiration to join NATO as a full-fledged or even a part-time member. The war, which began with Russia's invasion in 2022, has caused 1 million casualties on both sides. Following Ukraine's acceptance of this proposed 30-day ceasefire agreement, pending, of course, Russian approval, the diplomatic focus now shifts to Moscow. Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, is scheduled to visit Moscow this week, reportedly as early as Thursday. Also, Donald Trump, speaking to reporters at the White House, said he plans on a telephone call between himself and President Putin of Russia to try and test how much Russia is willing to engage. So here are the arguments for Russia accepting the ceasefire. It would be massive economic relief. It would put a huge pause on the Western sanctions that have been crippling the Russian economy over the last 3 years. Putin could also frame this as a PR victory. He could go out there and claim that he is the peacemaker and not Ukraine and not Zelensky. And of course, in the interim, he's also made some territorial gains in the Kursk region of Russia, which Ukraine had managed to covet and managed to acquire through a covert operation that happened last summer. Also, crucially, this will give some breathing space to Putin to allow the replenishment of exhausted troops. In fact, more than 1 million casualties have been cited on either side. This could be the much needed breather that Russian troops need. And also, this could give potential leverage in his future discussions with Trump, potential concessions from NATO, for example, which can explicitly say that they will not include Ukraine even in future talks. That is a concession that he can potentially draw out from Trump as and when the Trump-Putin meeting happens. The arguments against Putin accepting the ceasefire are that this would mean that there is a momentum loss for Russia. Russia recently gained about 12 odd settlements in the Kursk region just in the past week, since the announcement by the United States that it was pausing intelligence sharing and military equipment sharing with Ukraine. Russia has managed to reverse some of the losses that it suffered in the Kursk region. There will also be a hardline backlash in some sections of the Russian military. The pro-war factions may view a ceasefire as betrayal by Putin. Also, the previous ceasefires, and there is a massive trust deficit between both the warring parties, previous ceasefires, whether they were in 2014 or in 2015, collapsed because ultimately Russia violated the ceasefire. Historically, Putin has also tied any ceasefire agreement to several non-negotiable demands. That includes the recognition of some of the annexed territories like Crimea, the permanent neutrality of the state of Ukraine, effectively banning it from joining NATO. Additionally, Putin has also insisted on the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from areas that are controlled by Russia, like the Kursk region. If Putin were to accept the ceasefire, then it could lead to a temporary freeze in the front lines by mid-March. There would be a 10-mile radius, a 10-mile separation between troops of both sides. There could even be international peacekeepers in that 10-mile radius. This would likely be followed by renewed US and UK arms flows to Ukraine, as both countries would try and bolster Ukraine's defenses during that ceasefire period. The focus would also shift to territorial bargaining with Russia, possibly with Russia pushing for recognition of the 20% of Ukraine that it now controls since this war began, and Ukraine could, on the other hand, push for some kind of a security guarantee that will ensure that Russia will not further push with territorial ambitions into Ukraine. However, if Putin were to reject the ceasefire, then Ukraine might escalate its drone and missile strikes against mainline and mainstream Russian targets, including in the capital, Moscow. Additionally, the US and Ukraine could also agree to expedite an economic development deal involving Ukraine's natural mineral resources. This initiative was put on hold after the Oval Office bust up, and it aims to bolster Ukraine's economy and its long-term security guarantees. The deal is reportedly worth $500 billion in what is a trade-off that involves Ukraine pledging away a bulk of its rare earth mineral deposits to America. The suspension of intelligence sharing had in fact hindered Ukrainian forces significantly in Kursk, where Russian troops have now regained some of the lost territory. On Tuesday, Russia reportedly captured or recaptured about a dozen settlements in Kursk. In response, in his nightly address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had revealed that Kiev in fact proposed a partial truce covering aerial bombardments and naval combat zones, but the American delegation advocated for a much broader ceasefire for a 30-day period. Zelensky also highlighted the importance of resumed American military aid, but he said that this was not explicitly linked to the ceasefire. In the middle of all of this, there is the X factor, which is Trump's negotiating style, which could play a significant role in these talks. He might in fact offer Putin a direct summit if Putin keeps his end of the bargain, which is to keep the ceasefire holding for a 30-day period. And that could potentially lead to the first ever face-to-face meeting between Putin and Trump in this second term. Additionally, Trump could also offer sanctions relief in exchange for Russian cooperation, which might appeal to Putin because it could give him an economic breather. All right, let's try and make more sense of this by speaking with CNN's international diplomatic editor, Nick Robertson, who's now joining us live from London. So, Nick, do you reckon this deal that's been announced by the United States and Ukraine, 30-day ceasefire at that meeting in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, now sort of puts the ball in Putin's court in a way that Putin is pushed to a corner and he has no choice but to say yes to a 30-day ceasefire?
I'm not sure that he can say a flat-out no, and Putin is used to negotiating. His teams are very used to negotiating. They have a list of requirements and gains that they want out of this. They need to be able to play it to the Russian audience that this is a victory for them. So they will probably give some language that indicates that they're going to go along with this. But I think as we get deeper into the discussions with Russia, or the US officials do, they will find that there are caveats that are creeping up. We've already heard language language today from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, inverting facts for Russian advantage, if you will. And this is a tactic that Russia uses often. For example, he said, that it's been said a lot that there should be no talks about Ukraine without Ukraine in the room. And now we're having talks about Russia without Russia in the room, which is obviously flies in the face of recent reality that the US has had discussions with Russia recently before they had discussions with Ukraine. So these sorts of prevarications and lines like this of trying to take, one phrase and then turn it against the other side to get the conditions that they want and try to have the negotiations on their terms. This is the direction that I think the United States would be wise to expect that Russia's going to come at them in. So the initial language may be positive, but I think, it's going to take a very tough and experienced negotiation position and team, not just the pressure of President Trump, but a real skilled team that's ready to do the long negotiating miles with the Russians that the Russians are absolutely experienced in and will have every intention of exploiting.
So President Trump says he's going to be sending his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, to Moscow as early as this week. He's the one who's going to convince Putin to accept the terms of this deal. The question is, what if Putin does not agree? What happens then? And what may be the demands or concessions that he would seek to extract for agreeing to this deal?
Marco Rubio today on his journey on the way back from Jeddah on the way to Canada, stopping off in Ireland, and while he was there at Shannon Airport, he said that he believes today the Russians will get communications from the US side today. Witkoff, we've heard, may go to Moscow. We don't have a timeline for that, but the Russians seem to be expecting to get some detailed update from Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, the US National Security Advisor, who are of course leading the US team there at the talks in Jeddah with the Ukrainians. So the Russians will get some versions of this, and then there's a possibility of this conversation between President Putin and President Trump, which is likely to be the direction that Putin will want to go in and then hand it off to lower teams. But, I think, expect Putin to want to have this personal dialogue with Trump so Putin himself can figure out what is the cost of not going along fully with what the US says. There's been very little publicly that the US has said about putting pressure on Ukraine. President Zelensky was asked about that in the last hour or so. He said that he expects strong pressure to be put on Russia if they disagree. President Trump last weekend spoke about the possibility of tougher measures, the possibility of sanctions, possibility of tariffs on Russia. But until Putin himself is convinced that that is a real threat, he's unlikely to bend to it. And I think that's the reality of where US negotiators will find themselves right now.
All right, CNN's international diplomatic editor, Nick Robertson, thank you very much for joining us from London and putting that story into perspective for our viewers. Thank you.
Ukraine on Tuesday agreed to accept a U.S. proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire in the conflict with Russia. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced the agreement after more than 8 hours of talks between Ukrainian and U.S. officials in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia.
Today we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation.
Rubio said he would now take the offer to Moscow.
And we hope that they'll say yes to peace. The ball is now in their court.
The development comes after a stunning Oval Office shouting match between the presidents of the two countries.
You're gambling with World War III.
The rift had immediate repercussions for Ukraine. President Donald Trump canceled military support and ended crucial intelligence sharing. But as part of accepting the proposed ceasefire, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said Washington will resume sharing aid and intelligence with Kyiv.
And that's effective.
So it's been a diplomatic roller coaster since Donald Trump got elected back to the White House for his second term. He's made his diplomatic priorities very clear. He wants to put a quick end to the Russia-Ukraine war. He wants to make Gaza into a Riviera. And of course, there is the looming threat of tariffs, the Trump tariffs on every major trading partner of the United States. How does the world deal with this? Joining me now is Fareed Zakaria, the host of GPS on CNN. Thank you very much, Fareed, for joining us here on CNN News 18. I know you've been a student of foreign policy, of international relations. You've been a scholar of international relations. Have you seen anything like we saw on the 28th of February, that Friday morning at the Oval Office between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky? Have you seen anything like this in the 30 years that you've been covering foreign policy?
No, Zakka, I haven't. I don't think many people have seen it in 40, 50, 60 years. And what was striking about it was both the style and the substance. The style of taking, what are clearly private disagreements and differences that historically have been done privately. There was always the joke that people would come out of a big fight and they would meet with the president and say we had a free and frank conversation. Well, we saw the free and frank conversation on live TV as if we were, flies on the wall in a private meeting. It was extraordinary. And the way in which Trump and Vance ganged up on an ally of the United States was really unprecedented. So then we get to the substance. What that meeting represented was the United States effectively turning its back on an ally that, remember, it has promised to secure for 30 years now. In 1994, Ukraine gave up what was then the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It gave it to Russia, and in return for which it asked for guarantees on its security and sovereignty, which was signed by Russia, Britain, and the United States. So this is not, a recent friend or ally. The United States has been supporting Ukraine's sovereignty ever since really its founding, its modern founding. And for that to transform, so there's the style of how Trump handles Zelensky, but there's the substance of what he was effectively doing. Both are unprecedented.
I want to expand this now to the very future of NATO itself, because this is a fundamental rupture in the longest standing transatlantic alliance between the way the United States sees the future of Europe and the future of Ukraine, and how Europe sees the future of Europe. Do you think, like Trump's allies like Musk have been saying openly, that America should pull out of NATO? Do you think Trump will pull out the 100,000 troops, American troops who are there in Europe? What may this mean for the future of NATO?
Well, it's again unprecedented, and you're right. NATO is not just NATO is the oldest and most successful alliance in history. There's nothing even that comes close. It has kept the peace now. It has prevented a major world war for 80 years, longest period of great power peace, longest period of global prosperity. And you're right. There are many people in Trump's movement who believe the United States should withdraw from NATO, withdraw from the United Nations. That was also one of the things Musk endorsed. So nobody quite knows where this goes, but Trump has never said that. Trump has always simply talked about getting the NATO countries to spend more on their defense, which is a worthwhile goal. My guess is that the alliance, if it survives, has to be transformed. Europe will have to become a much, much bigger part of the alliance. And with that will come much greater degree of European autonomy from the United States. And so the alliance will, in a sense, get weakened because it will not speak with one voice. It will not have one clear leader. I mean, that's long in the future. But if the Europeans do, in fact, become equal partners to the Americans in terms of defense spending and capability, that'll mean a more equal partnership than the one that currently exists. So in a very strange way, Trump is making Europe great again.
I want to talk about another area where clearly, again, Trump wants to upend all the established rules, which is in trade. He's already imposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico. He's paused a great number of them. He's imposed tariffs on China. There are retaliatory tariffs from those countries as well. And starting April 2nd, he is threatening reciprocal tariffs with every single major trading partner of the United States, including India. How does India navigate this?
I think that it is highly likely that some version of what he's describing happens. He's said it too many times to simply withdraw. Now, reciprocal tariffs can mean many things. It can mean generalized tariffs on the country based on your average tariff. It could mean in each sector. It could mean even more detail than that. And nobody is quite sure what Trump means because it's a vague threat. Doing it on every sector would be incredibly complicated. So one assumes it's some more general tariff. Presumably, this is all a negotiating tactic to then get better terms. So what India should really try to do is to say to Trump, okay, we understand that you're going to put these tariffs on. Now let's talk about what do we have to do to have these tariffs taken off. And Trump will presumably make a series of demands. I think India is well positioned in this struggle because India has lots of low-hanging fruit that it can pluck. India and Brazil are the two most protectionist large economies in the world. India is incredibly protectionist. I mean, most people in India might be surprised to learn that, but China is much, much more open to foreign trade and foreign investment and all those kinds of things than India is. So India could give a lot, which would actually be good for India. It would create productivity, it would create growth, it would spur greater efficiency, it would lower costs for consumers. There are all kinds of benefits that would come from this. And it could at the same time seem to be agreeing to a Donald Trump demand and allowing him to declare victory, which is, the theatrics of this are as important to Trump as the substance. So I think India is in a very unique position to be able to actually cut a deal, bilateral trade deal that reduces the Trump reciprocal tariffs, in return modernizes the Indian trade system.
So tell me, again, I want to go down the line with where Trump is going with these threat of these tariffs. Is his ultimate aim to try and lower the tariffs, get, as he describes, a more level playing field with all of these countries, including India? And is he looking at bilateral trade deals with all of these countries? And if that is the case, what happens to the existing trading framework, the global trading framework under the WTO? I mean, is it pretty much, dead in the water?
Yeah, I think the WTO is largely dead. And I think Trump really does not believe in that kind of, was at the heart of the kind of open international order. And Trump is a critic of it. He thinks that the United States has not benefited from it. I realize that this will seem strange to people in India, really anywhere else in the world, where you look at the United States and say this is the most powerful country in the history of the world. What are they talking about? But Trump truly believes that the last several decades, 50 years, 60 years of free trade has been terrible for America. I don't know where he thinks America would be if it had been. I mean, America is already number one in almost by every measure of international economics, but he believes that America has been ripped off. So I suspect it will all be bilateral deals. I think that the WTO had problems anyway. It was badly set up for. I mean, you have a one country, one vote system, which sounds good, but it's a recipe for paralysis. It means Liberia has an equal weight and vote in the system as the United States or China. The appellate court system is stopped working partly because of America, but in general, the whole thing wasn't very well conceived. What I hoped would happen is that the United States would lead in the reform of the WTO and creating a more efficient and more effective one, which, by the way, China might have been willing to participate in. But I think much more likely is that Trump will simply abandon it and pursue a series of bilateral deals.
All right, and final word, Fareed. So, in the almost 50 days that he's been in office in the second term, and I want you to separate this in three buckets, right? International affairs, trade, and domestic. I think domestic is largely around this cuts that him and Musk are making to various government departments. In these three buckets, what do you think Trump really is? What's like the number one priority in these three buckets for him? Presumably, this is his last term unless he changes the constitution. I don't know. With him, you can never say. But by law, he's not allowed to run again. So what does he want to leave behind with in these three buckets?
It's a very good question. I think that the heart of Trump's own worldview is very much this protectionism. So I think he will want to essentially have, in some way or the other, crippled the world trading system and made it much more protectionist, mercantilist. I think average tariffs will rise around the world, even though, as I say, in India's case, they may come down. But I think, in the industrialized world, tariffs are 3%. I could easily see them going up to 5-6%, or doubling of tariffs, which is bad for everyone, bad for India, because the price of everything goes up, I think he's also somebody who wants a much less globalist, cosmopolitan world. So immigration restrictions, immigration reforms of various kinds. I wouldn't be surprised if, you see more happen on the H-1B, all that kind of thing, even though he has temporarily given Musk a reprieve on it. The heart of his program is very anti-immigration. And I think that on the domestic side, what matters most to him is, I think, the sense that he had a dramatic effect and an impact. So, I don't think this was his great ideology, but the deconstruction of the administrative state, savage cuts everywhere, I think are very important. That's going to be, that's what he's going to try to do. The federal government in the United States is not that big anyway. It's one of the lowest per capita number of federal bureaucrats compared to the population, certainly compared to the GDP. But again, it's one of the obsessions of the MAGA right. I think there will be an attempt to assert American power and the presidential power, particularly domestically, as opposed to Congress, as opposed to even the courts. There's a very big thrust, which is deeply worrying because it's anti-democratic in some ways. So that's the package. The thing I'm most sad about, back to the first set of things, is the absolutely savage cuts to international aid, to foreign aid. 83% of all foreign aid is now going to be cut. I was always very proud as an Indian American that the United States was the richest country in the world, in the history of the world. It was also the most generous in the history of the world. 4 out of every $10 of humanitarian aid worldwide came from one source, the United States federal government. But that is now in the past. And, all the kinds of programs that helped so many countries and so many millions of people in India escape disease, escape poverty, all those programs are being either savagely cut or shuttered entirely. And it's a very sad thing. It changes the image of America in the world, I think.
All right, Fareed Zakaria, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNN News 18 with your thoughts and perspective. Thank you.
Ukraine on Tuesday agreed to accept a U.S. proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire in the conflict with Russia. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced the agreement after more than 8 hours of talks between Ukrainian and U.S. officials in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia.
Today we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation.
Rubio said he would now take the offer to Moscow.
And we hope that they'll say yes to peace. The ball is now in their court.
The development comes after a stunning Oval Office shouting match between the presidents of the two countries.
You're gambling with World War III.
The rift had immediate repercussions for Ukraine. President Donald Trump canceled military support and ended crucial intelligence sharing. But as part of accepting the proposed ceasefire, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said Washington will resume sharing aid and intelligence with Kyiv.
And that's effective immediately.
Outside the White House, Trump said there would be a U.S. meeting with Russia to discuss the ceasefire plan soon.
Hopefully President Putin will agree to that also, and we can get this show on the road. I think it's a big difference between the last visit you saw at the Oval Office and this. So that's a total ceasefire. Ukraine has agreed to it, and hopefully Russia will agree to it. We're going to meet with them later on today and tomorrow, and hopefully we'll be able to wipe out a deal. If we can't, we just keep going on and people are going to get killed, lots of people.
Is Zelensky invited back to the White House?
Sure, absolutely.
Later, Russia's foreign ministry said it didn't rule out contacts with U.S. representatives over the next several days, according to state news agency RIA. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was in Saudi Arabia but did not participate in the talks, said the ceasefire was a positive proposal.
Вважаємо це позитивним.
He also said the two countries would work to finalize a minerals agreement.
І дійсно там прописано, що Україна готова прийняти, у разі, якщо Росія буде згодна на це, зробити як перший крок перемир'я на 30 днів для того, щоб почати дійсно готувати якийсь вже більш важливий документ.
A very warm welcome to the Hard Facts with me, Akanksha Swaroop. The daring train attack in Balochistan by the Baloch Liberation Army has sent shockwaves across Pakistan, bringing into focus the insurgency in the contested region.